rupees because it's almost impossible that you will. I'll give you, I have 1,000 rupees in my pocket. I can afford to give it. So come. Huh? Still not. I'm being unfair to you. What we found is percentage of population in intermediate cities. See, I could easily offer 1,000 rupees for that. But it's a fascinating thing. Intermediate cities in India, by the way, are cities between 500,000 and 2 million people. So in Europe, those would be very large cities. But in India, those are intermediate cities. So Kanpur is sort of already not an intermediate city anymore. Ahmedabad certainly is not. It's the kind of cities that you see springing up everywhere that become big very rapidly. Now that's a fascinating one. Because most development economists in history have always said we have to invest in agriculture to prevent people from moving to the city. You recognize that reasoning? You must have heard it in the past before. There's two problems with that statement. One is it's not actually possible to stop people from moving to the city unless you physically constrain their movement, which some countries in history have done, like China and Russia, the Soviet Union more correctly said. But otherwise, you can't stop them. The second is it's actually not a good strategy because I just talked about agriculture. The people in the rural area are not even helpful for agriculture because if you would want to increase productivity in agriculture, you actually have to move people off the land so that you can be more productive. It's a total fallacy to think that because many poor live in the rural areas, you only should work in the rural areas to alleviate poverty. It's a classic example of static thinking, which many economists, including in the World Bank, are often guilty of. If you look at the countries, that's another thing we did. We looked at large federal units, United States, Europe, pretending for a moment it was a country, Brazil and China, and said, when did they have long sustained periods of growth where they lifted large numbers of people out of poverty? And there were two things we saw. One is, each of these units, when that happened, were urbanizing very rapidly. That sort of corroborates the argument of the intermediate cities. The other is, all of them had economic convergence. In other words, the poorer parts of the unit grew to catch up with the rest. So that gave us a last interesting comparator, which is because India has very significant income differences between states. Bihar is by far the poorest, although fastest growing. Its per capita income would put it 3 from the bottom in Africa. And of course, some states have really high incomes. I guess Delhi actually has the highest income, but people think of it more as a city. But I think Delhi is in the $5,000 range, which is roughly the same as China. So extremely different place to pitch it. You could actually pick some states that look less like a city. I think Goa also has very high, but again, very small. But Maharashtra is high, Tamil Nadu is high, Karnataka is high, and significantly higher than the average. So, what we concluded was that if we wanted to be a helpful partner to India, so first of all, our money is irrelevant. Our money is about $4 or $5 billion a year. It's a lot of money. It's not a lot of money compared to the budget of the government of India. So we had to be really strategic if we wanted to use that money in any meaningful way. So we decided, why don't we just say we're going to shift our support for India to the areas that we found to be correlates for making growth more inclusive. And when we looked at our program, maternal and child mortality, we're already trying. Education, we're already doing. We're big partners in SSA, which is, by the way, a very successful program. Off-farm employment, no, we're trying, but I couldn't necessarily say that we've been very good. So we can keep trying, but get better at it by working more closely with IFC, our private sector arm. Economic convergence, the low-income states catching up with the rest. We had said for 2 strategies, that is 6 years, that we would increase our commitment in low-income states. We had not done it. So that was a pretty poor record. So that's a clear commitment we would have to make. If you want to be strategic, then you do not want to work against economic convergence. Why did it happen? Because India being a federal state and the political environment being what it is, we have a system where the Department of Economic Affairs and the Ministry of Finance is our nodal partner. And the system of coming to a project is states can propose projects to the Department of Economic Affairs. They then discuss them, see with us whether they fit in the strategy, then they ask us to do them. So the problem with that, the richer states have the better capacity to develop project proposals. So in a system like that, inevitably, you will favor the ones who are already ahead. Well, good economists will say that's good, it's competition, except the problem is the country is not a marketplace and the states can't actually move. Economic convergence is actually a necessity. So we put in place some specific mechanisms to help low-income states develop proposals faster by essentially putting money towards preparation of projects. We couldn't, in the political context, say advanced states cannot propose projects, because that wouldn't be allowed in a federation like India. So rather than put them down, we're supporting the others. The biggest shift is that we truly must understand much better how we can not just focus on supporting agriculture, but supporting the transition from agriculture to the cities. That's what we call spatial transformation. And the way I like to think about it is by thinking about Ashok. I've never met Ashok, but he's from UP and he's an imaginary figure, and he moved to the city. Now, when he moved to the city, he left his wife Preeti and their kids behind because he didn't know what he would find in the city, but he had a very hard time surviving on the farm, and there was no off-farm employment in his village. So he went to the city. The city was Kanpur. And he came to Kanpur, and when you think through what Ashok would meet in Kanpur, you realize that he would have to fight very hard to survive. Because it's really difficult. He thinks he's going to meet a better life, but just imagine his first few weeks, how difficult it would be and how hard he would have to fight. He'd probably end up pulling a handcart, or a rickshaw was probably not even achievable at that point. He would be really struggling for day-to-day jobs. Now guess what? In struggling that way, he already produces more economic growth than he did in the village. Because he was just sitting on the family farm, all sharing. He was doing a little bit, but not as much as in the city. But of course, Ashok doesn't want to stay alone, so eventually many Ashoks will end up getting to slightly better jobs, eventually better jobs, and eventually be in an environment where they say, now it's time where Preeti can come, and we might actually be able to have some place where we can live, and it would be possible to get the kids some form of education. If you think of what happens to those kids when they move to the city rather than stay in the countryside, their entire perspective on life is completely different. Their expectations are not going to be the same. It's already true in the countryside, by the way, but it goes exponentially faster in the cities. That's the transformation we're talking about. It's at the micro level, but it has huge macro impact. So one key theme of our strategy in India is spatial transformation. It is the most powerful driver potentially for poverty alleviation, except if you assumed much more revolutionary things, which I'll touch upon. But it's the most powerful driver in India right now of growth and poverty alleviation. And the key is to make sure that we work so that the secondary cities where the Ashoks come to are a little bit better when they get there, and eventually much better. Because why are cities good? Because people fight to survive, but also because it's actually more efficient to provide services in cities because of the agglomeration effect. Cities can be more competitive, which is really very useful, and can be great sources of innovation and jobs, and have been historically in many countries, including in India. So that's on transformation. Second theme is integration. And most people say that's about India working with Pakistan. Well, that would also be good, but I'm not actually stupid enough to make that my objective, because I would have two armies in between me and my goal, and I myself have never been in an army, so not much chance of succeeding. My thought of integration is much more simple. Imagine you have a little company in Patna, and you're starting to make something that you want to export. It doesn't matter what it is, really. So you need to, and it's something that is heavy enough that it has to go through a port. You're now having to reach the port of either Calcutta or Bombay, right? Whichever way you go, you're going to have to cross several borders. Yes, I know they're state borders, but when you go to a state border in India with a truck, you actually lose more time and money than you do in Europe when you go to a country's border. Because it is like exporting several times before you get to the port. Some of it is legal taxes, some of it is illegal taxes, makes no difference. You now know I like the GST, right? If you know, for those of you who know what the GST is, because it's part of the answer. Integration is making India a much more functional marketplace so that people are not as constrained in their local environment. Now, of course, that also means infrastructure, but personally, I think the regulatory side is more transformational because it's much cheaper to make it easier to cross a border than to build roads all over India, which we still should do. So integration is roughly about infrastructure and regulation. It's fairly straightforward, classic World Bank stuff, if you want to call that. But it is the second part of our strategy and still a big part of it. The most transformational thing we do is finance the Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor that goes from Punjab all the way to Calcutta. Because we focus on low-income states, it's the corridor that basically runs south of the Ganga, and 2/3 of India's poor live along that corridor. And there's a lot of intermediate cities forming. So we have sort of a strategic coherence in our strategy. Last one is plain vanilla, but actually super, super, super sensitive in India. It's inclusion. So that's about mother and child care, literacy, and all that stuff, but it's about much more than that. And I don't know what an outside agency can really do to help, because part of what is unique about India is unfortunately linked to social phenomena that trap many, many, many more people into low-level economic activity by virtue of who they are and where they were born than in almost any other country in the world. Because of issues of gender, India has one of the lowest labor participations of women amongst major countries, probably the lowest. And of course, issues of scheduled tribe and scheduled caste. Now let me stay away from scheduled tribe and scheduled caste for a minute because I don't know enough about it. All I can say is I have no servants because I'm happy to sweep my own floor, and I think it's really important that India comes to grips with the fact that the professional designation of groups where it is still effective, which is not universal, is a tremendous tax on the potential economic growth. That's all I want to say about it. Women is more easy. Today, in India, there are 50 million women between 15 and 24 who are neither in school nor working. 50 million. That's almost as much as the entire population of France. If you would get any decent level of economic activity out of these 50 million women, India's growth rate would already be in the double digits. Whether that can be achieved for the 15-year-olds, maybe for the 24-year-olds, it may be too late, because they're already 24 years old. Now you tell me how many women there are in India between 0 and 15, and how many there are unborn who could become part of that group, or could become part of a different group. A group that has a normal average rate of economic productivity. There is incredible transformational potential in realizing that the issues of gender in India are not just about what SEWA does. And actually, when I go to SEWA, SEWA is one of the best organizations I've ever been to. But what they do is take traditional activities and empower the women doing these activities, which was a great thing to do. But when you go to SEWA now, all they talk about is the daughters of SEWA. Because the daughters of SEWA do not want to be salt pan workers, do not want to embroider, do not want to be working based on rag picking and making the nice things that they make. They may not have as nice a cell phone as I do, but they have enough exposure to them to realize that maybe they just want to be a nurse or something like that. They don't all want to be IT workers, but they have different perspectives. And the potential in the fact that they have different perspective is tremendous. But it will only be realized if we find a way for Indian society to be incredibly more inclusive than it is today. So that's what I would want to say. I spoke for much too long. I really do apologize for that, but I hope it was somehow useful, and I'd be happy to take any questions, remarks, or discussion. Thank you very much.
people raise their hands.
Yeah.
Just identify them in the trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I have a question with regard to the malnutrition statistics of India.
Yeah.
Two economists from India, Professor Arvind Pranidhai and Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, has really contested that and said that the metrics that has been put is more relevant to European nations and African nations rather than because there are cultural differences. If you put the same thing in Japanese economy also, we'll have the same kind of variations. So what do you have to say on that?
So it's a good question to ask me because I'm Dutch and we're the tallest country in the world, and we actually grew on average 10 centimeters since World War II. Would you like me to repeat that? I've thought a lot about how that would be possible, and I can give you the answer actually. We're the only country in our neighborhood, Europe, where people drink milk through adulthood. And of course, we also put hormones in the milk for a long period since World War II. So it's a good and a bad thing taken together. The reason why I'm telling you this is this. So I'm not a medical doctor, nor am I a scientist, because I don't consider economics a science. It's a bit of a controversial statement, I'm afraid, but that's what I believe. The problem is this: scientists will tell you that if you take you and me, we both have children, and you take the children and you feed them the same thing for 2 generations, your children will be as tall as mine. And it's true for anybody from anywhere on the planet. That's what I couldn't believe that when I was told, but that's actually what shows. And actually, if you see second-generation Indians in the United States, you kind of understand what I'm talking about, because they look very different than Indians in India who stay in eastern Uttar Pradesh or something like that. It is politically convenient to say that Indians are destined to be lighter weight than other countries. I don't know. I'm not a medical or scientific person, but the people who work on this, at least in our institution, say that it is incorrect. That's all I can say, because I can't go deeper. Very happy in the series to bring the people in the team working on health and nutrition, because it's a deeply important topic, and it is the Indian myth. And the most puzzling part about the myth is that there are significant levels of malnutrition in the top quartile of the income distribution. That's really, really shocking, actually. So let's put that as one of the topics. Anybody else? Yes, and then you. Yeah.
You said that World Bank spent around $4 to $5 billion for India. So how do you audit that amount of money where it has actually gone?
Actually, we finance government programs. So when we finance actual government programs, it's the CAG that audits it. But they have to give us the audits so that we have the right to look at them. The CAG is a world-class organization, so that works really well. When we finance public sector companies, they're audited by private sector auditors because they're companies. And again, we check these audits. We have a large financial management team working on it. We also have our own investigative body to investigate any relevant allegation of corruption. A lot of staff time goes into that, but it's based on government systems, which in India is very possible because, again, the CAG is really one of the best supreme audit institutions in the world.
So I have a question on that.
No, you go and then see. On?
From Kerala's growth.
Yes.
The debate that growth they have right now is not because of any policies made in the state, it's only because of money flowing in from the and in spite having the highest literacy rate and having very good health policies, employment rates are not too high.
Insofar I understand Kerala, I've mostly focused on the low-income states, as you will understand from my introduction. But I do know that Kerala has a very high dependency on remittances, which is a phenomenon it shares with many African economies. And so what you described could be possible. But I'm not actually very knowledgeable about Kerala because it's one of the states where we're sort of less engaged now. The issue of jobs, however, is a really important issue. And it's a contentious issue because of some of the very sensitive topics that I talked about. So many people feel that these low-level economic activities that I sort of dissed, as they say in America, talk dismissively about, are a good way to provide jobs to people. And my counterpoint to that is that if what you do can be replaced by a vacuum cleaner, then it's probably not really true to say that you're creating a job. and it may not be the right way to get a better economic result. The issue, however, how to create the kind of jobs that people do want, going back to my Daughters of Sewa story, is a very difficult question. It's actually a very easy question conceptually, but a very difficult question in terms of politics and implementation. So if India wanted to create the number of jobs it needs to create, anybody know how many people enter the labor market in India every month? About 1 million. Okay, so we need 12 million jobs every year. You know how you do it? You think of being competitive like you